Okay, so welcome everybody to the second part of a two-part lecture on propaganda in Europe's 20th century. And you can see the first part on the YouTube channel. I think some of you probably already have seen it. And I will be making the occasional reference back to that lecture during this part of the session. But hopefully it will be clear enough for everybody, regardless of whether or not you've seen the first part or not. Uh, this second part is called the Ubiquitous Enemy, and the reason I'm calling it that will, I hope, become clear as the session goes on. What we have on the screen there, for example, is a fairly offensive to our eyes a piece of Nazi propaganda from the war years, and I thought it was quite illustrative of the way in which the regimes I'm going to talk about today saw hidden enemies behind the scenes in that were kind of undermining what they were doing. So a quick kind of recap about the purpose of propaganda, or how I'm going to use propaganda in this particular lecture. So propaganda is information designed to support a particular cause or damage an opposing cause. So in that sense, propaganda is not necessarily untruthful. And in fact, often it contains some nuggets of truth. So it's not always going to be kind of spun lies, if to use kind of the common argot today. But nonetheless, a lot of what I'm going to show you is going to be confected and overblown and exaggerated, and in some cases downright offensive. So kind of be aware that some of the things I'm going to show you are not going to be pretty in some ways. Its purpose, and for the regimes that I'm going to talk about today, which are the kind of well-known authoritarian regimes of the mid-20th century, principally Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But I will throw in one or two other regimes at times that kind of fit the bill of just being sort of generally nasty and crushing human beings under their iron heel. But those two regimes share certain things in common, and the way in which they use propaganda, albeit for somewhat different purposes at times, is one of the things that they have in common. The principal reasons for having propaganda are to persuade people to support the goals of a particular state, party, or movement in various ways. And that's used, of course, in liberal democracies as well as these rather unpleasant regimes that I'm about to talk about. But nonetheless, the way in which it's used in these regimes is kind of egregiously worse or more exaggerated than you tend to find in liberal democracies. To legitimize a regime, that is, a regime, of course, doesn't start off with the full confidence of its citizenry, and it may have problems of the way in which it is viewed by its citizens or its subjects, and legitimizing a regime in the eyes of the populace is very important for regimes that don't rely on democratic consent. So that's something that we'll see, certainly did see in part one, and will continue to see in part two. The other ones here are things that are going to be more concentrating on today than I did in the first part of this lecture. That is, instilling certain ideal behaviours in their population and demonising and ridiculing their enemies. Now, those enemies may not necessarily be real. They may be confected or they may be exaggerated. And those enemies may be both internal or external. The enemy here, in that opening slide, where the sort of grotesque caricature of the international Jew, in inverted commas, behind the flags of the Soviet Union, Britain and America, is both internal and external. The external enemies are the Allies, and their Jewish, the Svengali character, if you like, they're manipulated behind the scenes, is both internal to the Nazi regime, at least that's how the Nazis wish to portray it, and of course it plays a part behind the scenes in the three countries that are opposing the Nazi regime during the Second World War. And also it endeavours to influence public opinion in other countries. I'll say rather less about that, but I'll also make one or two allusions to it as we go on. So those are the principal purposes of propaganda. But these all kind of rest, or rather manifest themselves in a certain way. In the first lecture, I talked about some of the key things that these regimes that I'm talking about have in common. One was that they have an omnipotent or seemingly omnipotent leader, that is, somebody who's presented in a sort of kind of messianic way. I gave this particular example of Stalin. This is from East Germany in the 1950s. So that's one key element for both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, is to have a leader who sits above everyday concerns and has a kind of messianic gloss or aura around them. The other thing I talked about in the first part of this lecture was the way in which the regime sought to depict a sort of a glorious future of harmony between different elements of society, not including the enemies that I'm going to talk about. So they were driven by, or at least their propaganda was often driven by, the desire to promote the regime as not only achieving things in the here and now, but also moving towards some kind of future utopia. And then I started to talk about this right at the end of the last lecture, but didn't get very far with it, which is why we've got part two today. And that's in order for regimes to legitimate themselves and also to demonstrate their achievements, their populaces must be led to feel as if they are under threat on a day-to-day basis. And so the enemies of a regime, and bear in mind that those enemies can change over time as situations unfold, but those enemies must be portrayed in propaganda as ubiquitous, as potentially anywhere, and as extremely dangerous. One of the ways in which the ubiquitous enemies are pointed up and portrayed as evil and as seeking to undermine these utopian regimes is by caricature and grotesques, and portraying those enemies as physically different um, to the, the populations of the regimes against which those enemies are supposedly plotting. So right at the end of the last lecture, and by all means go back and have a look if you haven't seen it, I showed you a clip from a Soviet propaganda film from the 1930s called Victorious Destination, and within that film there were a number of different uh, grotesque caricatures of potential enemies of the USSR. So we had this. This is a still from the movie. This is a group of sort of international plutocrats who were predicting the failure of the Soviet Union, and in particular the failure of its industrialization program. So you can see that those people are drawn in a comical, exaggerated, grotesque manner. And we also had right at the end of that film this chap here. This is the kulak. Of course, kulaks didn't look like that. Kulaks, of course, were supposedly at least the better off kind of peasant who might have actually owned a little bit of land or and had kind of made a small profit from their farming. So that was a major class enemy that, from the point of view of the USSR, had to be eradicated. And in fact, actually, in the film itself, the kulak is kind of comedically eradicated by being buried by a tractor. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about today. The ways in which those regimes saw their enemies, or rather, what I'm going to do is to portray the way in which the regimes saw themselves, how they set themselves up, and then to maximise the contrast between their endeavours and the evil, sly, grotesque nastiness of their enemies that were seeking to undermine those efforts. So that means looking first at the way in which the regimes wished to portray their idealized citizen. This is an example from 1930. It's a poster aimed obviously at the rural population. Comrades, come join the collective farm. The Soviet Union had kind of run into a few difficulties with collectivization in the late 1920s, but it was at that point it was voluntary whether or not people joined collective farms, and there were major propaganda campaigns to encourage individuals to leave their own small holdings and to come and join these mass mechanized farms, which is what collective farms were. So this comes from the period where the Soviet Union is moving from a voluntary collectivization to enforced collectivization, which I can assure you was not pretty. But what I want to pick out from this particular image is not so much the message, well, the message is important, but the way in which these people look. Because both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and indeed most of the authoritarian regimes, whether they were of a fascist kind or of a communist kind, in the period that I'm talking about, the mid-century through to the sort of 1960s, 70s, portrayed their citizenry in a similar kind of way, in this idealized way, and they wanted to create this new woman, this new man. They were going to be rugged, keen to work, fit, healthy, ideologically inspired, and kind of utopian in their outlook as well. Relishing the fact that they were ostensibly at least building a new world. So you do see these very kind of like square-jawed and clean-cut looking um, individuals in both Nazi and Soviet propaganda, and they are presenting this sort of heroic aspect the of the ordinary citizenry as they are being encouraged to join in this great endeavour of creating a new nation, if you like. And to that end, this is from 1961, so somewhat later. I will dot back and forth in the chronology, but hopefully it will make some sort of sense. These are some excerpts from the Moral Code of the Builder of Communism. Now, I don't want to go through these in detail. These are the kind of precepts that underlay Soviet morality, as far as the regime saw it, the morality of the Soviet system. And those have long been kind of embedded in the society of the Soviet Union, but they had not tended to be made very explicit and codified in the way that they are here. So this is a part of the official party program of the 22nd Communist Party Congress. And this is the first time, to my knowledge, that the Communist Party attempts to codify, to bring together all what it considers to be the principles of Soviet morality, to which these wonderful, healthy-looking, clean-cut, athletic people here are supposed to adhere. The fact that they felt by 1961 that they had to codify these things and kind of make them explicit and write them all down suggests that they were having difficulty persuading people that the Soviet Union's morality was kind of understood by everybody, or indeed was holding up under with the temptations of other perhaps less oppressive systems on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I'm only going to pick up a couple of these things here. Some of these things look, in a sense, if they were kind of freely chosen, they look relatively uncontentious. You know, some things that perhaps people in all societies, regardless of their ideology, should aspire to. And not so much devotion to the communist cause, but certainly concern for the preservation and growth of public property and that sort of thing, honesty and truthfulness, and respect in the family, concern for the upbringing of children. All those things are relatively uncontentious, and you obviously find those in liberal societies as well, but not compelled in the way that they are in the Soviet Union. But there are some interesting things in here as well, because there are some clear attempts to insert into that moral code what was the new Soviet man, the new Soviet woman should be against. And so there's implicitly in here are the enemies of communism, and they are quite the boundaries. The net is thrown very wide here in order to draw as many potential enemies into the fold as possible. So the intolerance towards injustices, parasitism, dishonesty, careerism, and money grubbing. Well, that's a very wide and open to interpretation phrase. So could quite easily could catch people who were in any way a little sloppy in their morality, let's say, and who defines who the enemies of communism are? What makes an enemy of communism? But regardless, the new Soviet man and woman must oppose the enemies of communism. It also set up the Soviet Union to a few kind of moral problems, because this one here, the honesty and truthfulness, moral purity, simplicity and modesty in social and personal life, kind of rubbed up against the grim realities of Soviet life, in which people still carried on doing terrible things like um, leaving their wives and husbands and getting drunk and abandoning their children and all this sort of thing. All of these things were considered to be anti-communist, or at least certainly non-communist. So it became, by codifying this, it became easier for the regime to point the finger at people who were not living up to the ideals of the communist regime. But again, this is, I said, there's this ideal kind of body type as well as an ideal look and a set of behaviours in the Soviet Union. You can see that stress on athleticism and hard work and technical skill as well in the poster on the left hand side there. So collective farmer, be an athlete. And you'll, once again, that's the imagery there is very similar in terms of how those people are portrayed, with that physical strength and well, I suppose you call it a certain kind of athletic grace in that poster on the left hand side. You can see some allusions to sport there with the football, to getting on with some work. There's a tractor in the background there. A gentleman there who appears to be, I don't know, maybe he's drying his. He appears to be using a towel, but it may well be a piece of sports equipment. But also for military purposes, the presence there of the rifle and the knife are indications that this new Soviet man or woman must be prepared to fight and to have military skills against potentially their enemies. And that is reflected very much so in the other authoritarian regimes that we see in Europe at this time. So I've deliberately drawn a comparison there between the poster from the Soviet Union, this one here from Nazi Germany, 1934. Note here, this is a kind of a nice. This is classical imagery in the sense that it's similar to the kind of images that one gets from the ancient cultures, or ancient European cultures anyway, Greece and Rome also, but there's also a somewhat modern look, sort of almost a slight sort of cubist feel. I'm not an art historian, I'm afraid, but the way in which that figure is drawn seems to be drawing on different traditions there. But again, the body image, the look of that woman is very similar to what we see on the other side of the screen there. And again, there is this sort of a sense of the heroic about that particular image. And like the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany too also had an ideal of the perfect new Nazi woman and Nazi man who were going to be looking very similar to the idealized Soviet man and woman. BDM, the Reich Sports Day for the BDM. BDM is Bund Deutschen Maden, which is essentially the female wing of the Hitler Youth. And so sports and physical activity are heavily promoted by both the Nazi regime and by the Soviet Union as a way of kind of helping to create that fashion, that new persona for their citizens. Now, this kind of new this new ethos for the ordinary citizen is reflected in lots of different ways. It's far from limited just to hard kind of physical activity or military skills and athleticism. It's kind of reflected in everyday life, and I'm going to show you a little film now. This is called Model Home on Library Lane. It's silent, so I will talk over it a little bit, if I can find it. And this is from 1932, so it is a propaganda film, and I'll give you some explanation. There's a kind of a very short digest of what the film is showing, which is at the moment sitting immediately above the box in which the video is about to play. But I'll explain what's happening a little bit as it goes along. But here you need to be looking out for the contrasts between the ideal forms of Soviet behaviour, if you like, and the forms of behaviour that are more associated with enemies of the regime, if you like. Okay. So this is a new building that's been constructed by the Soviets, and clearly there's a certain amount of pride at that construction. Now you're seeing inside the building here. That's a bedroom of one of the apartments inside the new. Gentleman there. Notice the bust of Lenin on the bookcase there. You may remember that from the last lecture. This is another room that is ostensibly inside the building and is now rotting and an absolute mess. You know, pants on the floor and that sort of thing. These are local children. They were carrying things like shovels and brooms and such like. Happy little Soviets. Now what they're carrying there is is a wreath which is the Order of the Bedbug, which they are now attaching to the door. We are supposed to believe of the dirty house, the apartment that's been let go to rack and ruin. There's a model of a bed bug, which is enormously amusing for the youngsters. Okay, so what was happening there was essentially a piece of social shaming. It's confected. It's not real. This is in the sense that they're not filming something that happens in real time, but it is intended to show how leaving your apartment in a mess is a sin, is a disgrace to the Soviet ideals. I very much doubt that the shots of the untidy, dirty room were actually shot in that apartment, but it's almost certainly going to be something that's been manufactured for the purposes of the film. But the order of the bedbug is to socially shame the occupant of that flat into rectifying their behaviour so that he or she can sort of rejoin the ranks of all good Soviet citizens and not be a slovenly wreck. Now, this is not to say, of course, that that kind of social shaming didn't go on in lots of other regimes, in lots of liberal countries and democratic countries as well. But I think you find it very hard to find an occasion in which a liberal democratic country was having a film made by the state about social shaming in that way over an untidy apartment. So that kind of shows the difference between the authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes there, and the way that even people who were untidy and slovenly and could be seen as letting down the ideals that we saw here, albeit that this is from later, but it kind of, as I've said before, this is kind of a codification of something that had been there for a very long time within the Soviet regime. People who were kind of flouting those at the time kind of unwritten laws of Soviet purity could find themselves labelled as enemies of the regime and subject to this kind of propaganda attack. That's a relatively light example, and of course things become a lot more serious when one considers the types of enemies which these regimes built up into kind of monstrous, all-consuming and ubiquitous enemies. So you can have these kind of domestic enemies who are relatively innocuous and are more or less figures of fun, but also these regimes attack individuals and groups who are seen as insidious and manipulative and attempting to undermine the regimes on a more serious level. This is as you can see, an extract from a late 1930s German schoolbook, and really, a singularly offensive caricature of a Jewish businessman, let's say, on the right-hand side, contrasted with the strangely nippleless Aryan ideal, Nazi new man ideal. Again, this is very similar kind of imagery as we saw a few slides ago with regard to the Soviet Union. So obviously this is essentially preaching to kids, this is your ideal here on the left hand side, this is what you should be aiming for, young men, and this is your enemy with all his cosmopolitan traits like reading a paper, smoking a cigar, and all these things that are seen to be morally doubtful at best. Now I show you that to show the kind of level of saturation, that this is not something that is purely directed at adults. This is something that the identification of enemies of the regime starts very early and is given in this fairly sort of uncut form, to be honest. to young kids as well. Likewise, more grotesques again. The Nazis, this is the program for the Degenerate Music Exhibition in 1938. It was a follow-up to the, oddly enough, wildly successful Degenerate Art Exhibition that had happened the previous year. The Nazis had a degenerate art exhibition, and they ran it alongside an art exhibition of the best of new Nazi art, or at least art that was the Nazis approved of. These two exhibitions ran kind of side by side, and the degenerate art was supposed to be full of images that the Nazis in one way or another thought of as distasteful, certainly as antithetical to the regime, to show how terrible, I suppose, Western liberal society was. Unfortunately for them, the degenerate art exhibition got more visitors than the kind of approved Nazi art exhibition at the time. But still, they persisted, and they also had this degenerate music exhibition as well. You see this quite horrible caricature here. But even this saxophonist, even the black saxophonist, is being associated with Judaism. But there's these kind of grotesques are designed to instill fear to some extent, but also that the regimes wanted these the enemies to be mocked as well, and be seen as well, humorous is not the right word, but is not adhering to certain ideal types, at least. So we have things like that in Nazi Germany. In the Soviet Union, we have some more grotesques here. And the priest's cross has got a serrated edge of a saw, and he's attacking the pylon there whilst kneeling on the head of the drunkard. Also another grotesque. And once again, these are the enemies of the regime. They are both kind of comedic, but they are also dangerous. For different reasons. The priest is seen as sort of actively trying to stop the march of Soviet modernity, and the drunk is abetting him purely by his kind of moral corruption of slouching off into his own world of alcoholism. This is a huge thing, by the way. Alcoholism is a major problem in the Soviet Union, and it's. I mean, I haven't looked at every example of Soviet propaganda. Who could? I mean, there's so much of it, but it is so I wouldn't say it's the most common trope, but it is a trope that exists and is repeated really from the very early 1920s all the way through right to the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. The problem of the drunk and the problem of alcoholism kind of undermining Soviet ideals and the idea of this sort of perfect new Soviet man. So if you want to go poking around and looking for pieces of Soviet propaganda which identify enemies of the regime, then curiously enough, the alcoholic is considered to be one of the main enemies of the regime, not actively, of course, but as kind of abetting those who would seek to do the communists harm. There's a few more here. It's sometimes said that Soviet Union didn't use racial propaganda, or at least propaganda which you kind of see far more openly in Nazi Germany, and in a way they didn't. But they clearly were also keen to use ethnic caricatures and stereotypes. At times, they would tend to dress these things up as attacks on religion rather than attacks on individual ethnicities. But this is pretty common. The Soviet Union's attacks on Islam in its southern republics, what we now kind of colloquially call the stans. This kind of propaganda is fairly common, attacking Islam. There's and you see similar sorts of things which attack not so much Jews per se, but certainly Judaism. That's again a fairly common trope in certain areas of the Soviet Union. Interesting here, of course, we've got the Union of the Tatar Godless, who are driving the tractor. This is a kind of very similar type of image to what we saw in the cartoon film I showed you at the end of the last lecture, at the end of part 1, where the kulak tries to stop the tractor and gets run over by the tractor. So this seems to be quite a neat little metaphor that the Soviet Union likes to employ from time to time. This is one of the few examples I've found where you've got, which is addressed to occupied peoples in the Soviet Union. This is in the period of the Operation Barbarossa, when the first stages were Nazi Germany invade Ukraine, and this is directed at the people who have been occupied. So they've simply driven back the Soviet front line, and an attempt to, I guess, win over ordinary Ukrainians, the ones who haven't been killed by one side or the other, and to depict again Judaism being behind the mask of Stalin. And then something slightly more kind of amusing, I guess, certainly less grim than some of the other images I've shown you on these slides. And this is Stop the Yankee Beatles. This is from East Germany in 1950, where they had a plague in East Germany of Colorado beetles. The probably be familiar. These are the beetles that basically devour potato crops. So rather than just accepting this, of course, as a sort of a natural phenomenon, or as down to maybe bad farming techniques, the East German Communist Party decided to blame it on American planes dropping dropping these Colorado beetles on their farmland. So that's what that is about. Um, so this kind of anthropomorphism of the beetles into kind of little weapons of the United States. Um, uh, of course, it's completely untrue. It was just, uh, but it was kind of useful propaganda to show those those enemies are potentially everywhere, and the more that one can create a sense, if you're a member of the kind of the ruling elites within these regions, the more one can create a sense that the enemy will stop at nothing to kind of destroy you and is everywhere and is even in in insects, um, the more you create doubt in the minds of your citizenry, and hopefully enough fear that kind of sustains the regime, um, that the regime can kind of protects you against these things. Oh, yes, another film. This is from a Nazi film called The English Disease. Now, hopefully, I'm going to be able to set this up okay. Um,
England kann den traurigen Ruhm für sich in Anspruch nehmen, dass dort die Rachitis am stärksten verbreitet ist. Bereits im 17. Jahrhundert wurde sie hier beschrieben und heißt seitdem die englische Krankheit. Und diese Krankheit benutzte England im Weltkrieg als Kampfmittel gegen uns, wie der Ausschnitt aus dieser englischen Zeitung beweist.
Okay, I'm just going to stop it there because at that point it becomes a little more obvious what it is that I was showing you. That, believe it or not, it was as a public health film from 1941, so it is during the war. But I'm giving you that to demonstrate that even something as relatively innocuous as a public health thing, it's a way of it's about eating healthily, essentially, and the things that ordinary Germans can do to try and prevent people getting rickets. But it's framed in a way which allows the kind of the saturation of this sort of enemy-driven or propaganda, which demonizes a particular enemy, frames that entire movie with that very dramatic music at the beginning, and then of course those kind of grotesques that are seen marching across the screen and being associated very explicitly with England, by which of course the film means Britain. So you see the kind of techniques that we saw on the posters being applied to something which is as relatively innocuous, as I say, or at least for the public good, as a health information film there. Okay. Now, I'm going to move very quickly with one eye on the time to the last little section of this lecture. And the last point that I kind of want to make is the way in which, and that health film is kind of archetypal of that, the way in which the regimes that I've been talking about had kind of saturated life, everyday life, even the relatively humdrum things, with imagery about the regime, its utopian vision, its achievements, and the threats to it. And the threats to it, of course, are those ubiquitous enemies that I'm talking about. And one of the ways that these regimes do that is to kind of saturate the public sphere, the public, just the streets of towns, with lots of imagery, particularly, especially in the Soviet Union, to some extent in Nazi Germany as well, especially statues. So you've got, again, and these statues here, on the left-hand side here, this is the worker on kolkhoz. Kolkhoz is collective farm, by the way. So you've got the industrial worker and the collective farmer, the female collective farmer there. The chap is holding a hammer, the woman a sickle. But again, they have that look, that heroic look that we saw back in the poster where people being encouraged to join the collective farm. They have a certain martial look about them, and they have a certain body type and a clean cut, relatively kind of almost sort of bland look about their faces. Likewise, the farmers. This is more peaceable kind of statue, I think, in comparison to the rather aggressive worker on kolkhoz woman. But again, very similar in terms of the look of those individuals. And there aren't that many really good photos of Nazi statues available on the internet, which is in one sense is a shame. Those that do exist tend to be taken from books or at the time, and although there was plenty of Nazi statuary, most of them were kind of like just destroyed, of course, at the end of the war. Whereas most of the Soviet and communist statues were not completely destroyed when those regimes fell. So that's why it's kind of harder to get hold of Nazi statue images. This is one of the better examples that I've found. This is at the gateway to the Olympic Stadium in 1936, which was later relocated to the centre of Berlin. And again, that kind of imagery which combines an idea, and again, look how bland their faces are, really. But this is the ideal type, and it's slightly in the sort of classical vein. Yes, I think it would definitely. Now, sometimes you don't get a sense of seeing those small images of the kind of magnitude of those sculptures. That is the pavilion. This is the worker on kolkhoz woman was forged in 1937, and it was made for the World's Fair, which was being held in Paris. Although it was again later relocated back to the Soviet Union, and that's the Soviet pavilion at the World's Fair. and that is the statue on top of that pavilion, and you can see the size of that statue, or get a sense of the size of that statue with uh, the figures at the bottom there. Those are people, and that's the size of the statue. um, Not all were that big. In fact, probably only a relatively small minority were that big, but they were all they're all pretty massive. And these are, you'll see those they were constantly present in the streets of most towns and cities in the countries that I've been talking about. Here's another. This is a bit unusual. This is a door knocker for the City Hall in Louth, in Baden-Württemberg, which is installed in 1938. You will see that the knocker, the handle of it, the bit that does the rapping, has a swastika on it. There is a rather unpleasant caricature of a Jewish guy who is being rapped by the door knocker. So this is what I mean about saturating the public sphere in terms of just inserting things into everyday scenarios, so that one's constant gaze, even if you're not kind of conscious of it, is being bombarded with images and references to the regime and its achievements and its enemies. So there are well over 30 towns and cities in Germany have several streets named after Hitler. I wasn't able to find a reliable one that I thought was genuine photograph of any of these signs being put up, but I was able to find a couple of good shots of them being taken down. So this is an American soldier after the conquest of Berlin, taking down the Adolf Hitler Strasse sign there and replacing it with a kind of makeshift Roosevelt Boulevard one. But it's very common to have streets named after not only Hitler but other kind of luminaries in the Nazi Party. Likewise in the communist regimes as well. There was a genuinely a big effort on the part of the communist parties to rename things after their luminaries. Okay. Here's another quick statue as well. This one's a little bit smaller than the kolkhoz worker. I chose this one just because I thought it was so terrifically dramatic. This is the worker racing into the future, two different angles on it. The reason it looks a bit odd there is because it's one of those that was taken down and moved to these kind of statue theme parks where people would come and kind of gawk at the statues that were removed from public squares post the collapse of the communist regime there. But again, you've got a fair idea of scale there by the tourist, I assume, there against the statue. So again, even these, this is a fairly sort of more standard size statue, but still, obviously, as you can see, pretty big. And then I thought this was rather neat. It's not really the streets of a place, but this is actually a poster. Looks odd, difficult to know what that is, but this would have been displayed in a lot of workplaces, and during the 5-year plan, as cuddly old Joe up in the left-hand corner of the poster. This, believe it or not, was supplied to most workplaces and it's an Employee of the Month board, believe it or not. So a picture of the Employees of the Month, those who have produced the most number of, I don't know, wheels, cogs, or dug the most coal, or whatever it might be, they'd have their photograph inserted into the little circles, and as a kind of a treat. But again, it's that shows the way in which the regimes conceptualize their citizenry, and the way in which they try to encourage them into this all-encompassing building of the great future. And then finally, just a few. I'm just going to go through these really quickly, just to show you how this saturation occurs. So you get imagery. I chose this. I haven't had much or anything from fascist Italy so far, but they did something very similar as well. That's a perfectly normal, ordinary school report card there, of the winged angel sitting on top of what appears to be a pile of weaponry. That's a perfectly normal school report card from Italy in the 1930s. There, that's a book for kids, a children's guide to Lenin. Again, I said earlier on about the how these regimes trying to get the kids early, to sort of inculcate them into the habits of the ideology. So that's a lovely children's book. I'm sure many children were very grateful to receive that in their stockings. Stamps. Well, stamps used in every single authoritarian regime, and a lot of kind of liberal democratic ones as well. But they are used in every authoritarian regime to glorify the regime, because it's something that people use practically every day. People would post things on a far more regular basis than we would do nowadays. So that's to celebrate Marshal Pétain's birthday there, and some lovely fascist imagery to stick on your postcard you're sending up to the occupied zone, let's say. And then finally, this rather unpleasant thing here, which is a German children's board game called Jews Out. So, as I say, this kind of saturation is it's kind of complete, and it's hardly surprising that the regimes exert these enormous hold over their population in consequence. Okay, that's the main body of work, if you like, done. That's who we are, the Arts and Humanities Society, or LRAC. That's how you can contact. That's how you can contact them. That's where all their events are shown, and that's me. I'm going to put these into the chat box as well, but I will stop the recording before I do.